Thanks for keeping it Citizen TV. My name is Wahiga Mwaura. And of course today, all focus on Parliament buildings. Actually, more specifically at this moment, all focus is on Treasury, where at this time, Treasury CS Uhuru is just wrapping up before he negotiates that short distance between Treasury building on Harambee Avenue. Actually, those are some of the shots we are showing you right now. All the way, well, not too far, not too long a distance, to Parliament Road, Parliament buildings, where he will present budget highlights and revenue-raising measures for the national government for the financial year 2021-2022. Of course, it's the biggest budget in the country's history so far, a whopping 3.66 trillion Kenya shillings or so. And remember, we are a country torn between a couple of things. There's a pandemic, it's still not gone anywhere, ambitious infrastructure projects as well. Don't forget those IMF conditions and a population that are saying we need to breathe. We need some support here. The last couple of months have not been easy for many Kenyans. Over 2 million jobs shed as a result of the pandemic, but also an unemployment situation that was critical even before that pandemic as well. And so there's a lot to talk about, and all focus will be on that briefcase that the Treasury CS will carry, not because it will necessarily present anything new. Remember, the budget-making process under the 2010 Constitution is more of a year-long process as opposed to a surprise that is fully in the domain of Treasury. But nevertheless, many Kenyans will be keenly waiting to hear exactly what the Treasury CS will say, especially when it comes to sectors that are crucial to them. I also have analysts, some of the best in the country, who will be joining me to talk a little bit about the budget and of course react and respond to what will be tabled there in Parliament. We have Caxton Kinuthia, who's the head of tax, KPMG East Africa. He is on my right, and on my left I have Hesbon Omolo, council member ISPAC, together with Michael Mburugu, who is a partner with PKF Kenya. And that's what we'll be talking about. Remember, we keep showing you pictures from the 14th floor of Treasury, where the Treasury CS, I believe, should have left, if not already. Okay, not yet. He's still in his office. Those are images from that location there at the ground floor, where some pictures will be taken, those famous pictures. He took them. His predecessor under the 2010 Constitution also took them as well. And of course, we know previous finance ministers under the old Constitution also followed that beaten path to Parliament. Of course, there have been many questions about what sort of budget is this. And yesterday, we had a live exclusive interview with the Treasury CS Uhuru. He spoke to Jeff Koinange on JKL, and the CS called it a recovery budget. I wonder if my guests agree with that this is actually a recovery budget. Caxton, let me start with you on this one. Would you use those terms to describe what you've seen so far?
Actually, I have a better term for this year's budget, Wahiga.
What would you call it?
And this one, I will say it is really not my wisdom. I always try to ascribe to the people that have come up with some of those terms. It was just, I think, this morning that somebody says, for us as a country, we are in a trilemma. We know of a dilemma, yeah? But this year's budget is actually a trilemma. And a trilemma, they say in this age of Google, ignorance is a choice. I just had to go check whether that is a proper term. And I saw that a trilemma really means a situation in which a difficult choice has to be made between three alternatives, and especially where these alternatives are equally undesirable. Mm-hmm. So which are these three things that I think that we are having to grapple with? First of all, we have a very, very big budget, 3.6. As you said, it is a record budget. And a friend of mine yesterday was telling me the media people should stop using the term record budget. It is like saying you're 1 year older every new year. It is a matter of course. But I said sometimes, yes, it can actually go low. So we have a huge budget. That's the first dilemma, or trilemma. Then we have a depressed economy. The outlook does not look good. Yeah, we have contracting sectors. People's disposable incomes are low. And then thirdly, we have a pandemic going on. It is really a tough time for one Honorable Ambassador Uhuru Yatani to come and present. I'm actually as anxious as all of you to just see how he wants to tell us how we will balance all these things.
And how we'll raise the revenue. And I want Michael to respond to that. But let's listen to actually what the CS said yesterday It's all focused on him, but this was his view of what sort of budget he will present in the next hour or so. Let's listen in.
Relief are you going to provide for the common mwananchi, Waziri?
This is going to be a recovery budget. We have set all our parameters. We are going to continue sustain expenditure by implementing the Agenda 4. We are going to enhance the economic stimulus package that we initiated in this financial year. And there are vast of them, including the Kazi Mtani, by creating jobs and opportunities for people, by expanding jobs in the medical sector, by expanding jobs by having more teachers, to stimulate consumption, like, the way we are dealing with now the issues of desk, support the furniture industry. We are supporting the tourism industry through employment of scouts, game scouts. And at the same time, we are also undertaking the economic recovery strategy with targeted interventions, particularly one of the sectors that has started doing very well, the ICT. With the onset of COVID, many people are working from home, and that's a sector that has expanded. So we want to continue investing more to enable our people realize the opportunities that are bound within the ICT sector.
That was last night. Treasury CS Ambassador Uhuru Atani speaking to our Jeff Koinange, calling it a pro-mwananchi budget, a recovery budget. We actually have live pictures, and we'll be showing you that shortly from Treasury building, as that same man then exits the building, negotiates his way to Parliament, and that will be, we'll be showing you that shortly. But Michael, let me bring you in now. We struggled to fund a 2.8 trillion budget. Now we are talking 3.6 trillion. Is it time for a reality check as a country?
Thank you, Wahiga. Just to start off, I think Caxton spoke so philosophically. I want to bring the point closer home with very simple analysis of the situation. First of all, 2.8 trillion, if you take stock, you realize that we did not achieve probably even 3/4 of that. If you look at the government balance sheet, in terms of the projects they intended to deploy within that period of time, quite a number of them have not happened. But for me, besides Caxton's trirema issue, I think it's not a recovery budget. Remember, a few months ago, Treasury itself came up with post-COVID-19 economic recovery strategy. In this particular budget, I see absolutely nothing for that, because for me, if we are in a recovery mode, the first thing I would have expected to see is nothing else in this budget but a clear plan on how to vaccinate our people. You cannot reopen this economy fully. You cannot recover anything unless you deal with the issue of vaccination. It's the only way that the US and many other countries have been able to reopen their economies. I look today what is happening in Western Kenya, in Kisumu, Siaya, the ranches, Western Kenya, and Nyanza. It's most likely that that part of the country is going to be closing down. And potentially, the experts are talking of the fourth wave. So with this start and stop kind of a situation, it is not possible to talk of a recovery budget when you have not sufficiently addressed the issue of vaccinating our population.
What kind of budget is it? It's not a recovery budget. How would you describe it?
Confused.
Hesbon, do you? Okay, Hesbon, hold on. Let's take a full screen there. Show you pictures from Treasury building. There is the man himself, Treasury CS Ambassador Uhuru Atani. Of course, this is an old tradition. The truth of the matter is the contents of that briefcase are not fully a secret. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, the budget-making process is now a year-long one. It starts in August when circulars are issued to government departments advising on how to prepare budgets for the year. Counties also weigh in September as well. In October, the cabinet also comes into play. And at the very start of the new year, the Commission of Revenue Allocation also submits its recommendations on the division of revenue. We know that in February this year, the budget policy statement, division of revenue, county allocation of revenue bills are submitted to Parliament. But nevertheless, I guess there is something to this kind of picture that as a nation we still want to hold on to. Many remember the days of finance ministers, and you know, I can mention a few famous previous finance ministers who stood there, including President Uhuru Kenyatta, former President Mwai Kibaki, George Saitoti, the late Musalia Mudavadi, the late Simeon Nyachae, the late John Michuki, and of course Majority Leader Amos Kimunya. They've all stood there. Coincidentally, no lady has stood there, gentlemen, and held that briefcase. I noted that yesterday as I was just reviewing budget making over the years. But nevertheless, this very symbolic gesture for the press, for the world, and this is happening across East Africa as well. Remember, the budget reading happens across, should be 4 East African countries, and then thereafter we know the Treasury CS and his team, Treasury executives, will then make their way to Parliament buildings to present those budget highlights and of course explain to the nation exactly how they plan to fund this budget. 3.66 trillion, that's what we are talking about. And there are many concerns, including some of my guests here who understand the numbers better than me, about really where we are going to get this money from. And so that's the situation right now. And we will continue to bring you live pictures from Treasury even as we continue. And I was just about to bring in Hesbon Omolo, who is a council member at East Park, and I'm also glad to have Rose Mwaura here, the immediate former chairperson at East Park, who's joined us as well. I'll give her a chance to settle down and allow her to weigh in. But Hesbon, we left Michael saying he feels a bit confused when he looks at the budget. He doesn't see its direction. Do you have a better perspective or a different one from him when you look at so far what's been tabled before Parliament?
Thank you, Waigwa. I think where we are, I would agree with my colleague Kome. We are basically on what I would call autopilot. The ground crew who were supposed to put brakes on the aeroplane have basically abandoned their job. And we are in a scenario where the issues of vaccination has not been properly addressed. We have a 3.6 trillion budget. Out of that 3.6 trillion, we know that we can only raise about 1.7 trillion. As a percentage of GDP, we are talking about close to 15% in terms of revenue collection, against OECD benchmark of about 30% or thereabout. So as it is, we are already in a very bad situation. And the key thing would be, even as we read the budget today, we don't even know in 2020 what was the GDP of the country. We are still estimating because the department that was supposed to do that has not done it by April. So we are grappling in the dark and making estimates that we know may end up widening the deficit. So I think there's a lot of gaps in terms of this budget, and the realization that in another year we have elections, maybe somebody else will have to deal with it. But the key thing for me is if you have a budget that gradually the deficit keeps expanding, the revenue is growing at a faster rate, the budget deficit grows at a faster rate than our revenue streams, we can only head towards a cliff. And therefore, we need to step back, ask ourselves, even at a family level, if you are receiving a salary of 200,000, and you consistently do a budget of 360,000, borrowing consistently, hoping that things will get better, and you are not slamming brakes on some of your expenditure areas, and the key ones that would help you with recovery are also now left beside. Today, you would look at the PFM Act and wonder, did it really intend that you would not have recurrent expenditures financed from debt? Now we are there.
You know, all of you are, and can I bring in Rose now? I want to also get her perspective on this. Yes, I see that she settled down. I don't know if you hold the same perspective or if you have a more optimistic view, because so far my 3 guests have all sort of poured cold water of sorts on what will be read finally by the Treasury CS, and I'm sure many Kenyans watching us from across the country wonder, is there any hope? Do you have a different perspective from them? Your reading so far of what you've seen from the documents that have been tabled in Parliament about the priorities of this country, budget-wise?
Thank you so much for having me here. We definitely have a challenge when I look at this budget. Of course, key among those ones is we look at some of the key areas. Of course, the fact that we're spending much more than we can even collect. And even our ordinary revenue that we're projecting is really way, way over optimistic. When we look at where we have been in terms of revenue collections, and we look at what we are targeting to collect this year, and we also look at what we're targeting to spend, the 3.6 trillion. And of course, we've even a budget deficit of almost 1 trillion shillings. So we'll making sure we're going to add another 1 trillion shillings to our borrowings in the current year. And then, of course, you look at the key. There's 3 areas that are very, very critical for the economy to continue expanding. One is really the issue of healthcare. I think I had my colleague Mburugu talking about it, that if we have not planned to spend enough in terms of vaccination, we've seen in all the countries that unless you can vaccinate a critical mass of your people to make sure then that people are able to then start going out and reopening without having to worry about the surges in the infections and the impact it has on healthcare, then that's a critical area, number one. Number two, when I look at how much we've allocated to the manufacturing sector and even to the COVID recovery in terms of, if actually you look at the sector allocations, the manufacturing sector actually has been allocated one of the lowest. I think, I don't have the numbers, it was like 7.5 billion. In terms of the allocations, where you look at the road and transport sector was allocated 230 billion. And really this is the sector that's going to drive the growth, right? Drive the growth, drive employment and so forth. And then you see how low some of that, the allocations are. So when you look at those areas, and of course, we must, as I always say, we must cut our cloth. Must cut our coat according to our cloth. Isn't it? So we cannot continue spending 3.6 trillion, up from 3 trillion, which we've done consistently. We've had a budget deficit of maybe more than 7.5% every single year. So it's as what Hesbon has said, you're pretty much, you can afford to live in a house in, I don't know where, but you want to go and live in Runda, and yet we really are not there. So there is, we're definitely headed for challenging times. We know next year is an election year. We know that the Jubilee government is very keen in terms of completing a lot of the infrastructure programs. So of course, and we see that in terms of the allocation for the budget. But really the things that are important in terms of resurrecting our economy have not been given the due, I would say, the due attention in this budget.
That they deserved. And I have a follow-up to that, but first let me just allow our viewers to take in what's happening on the screen. That convoy carrying Treasury CS Uhuru Yatani and his team slowly snaking down Harambee Avenue towards the little roundabout there before they negotiate the curve towards Parliament Road into Parliament Building. Remember, this is a very hard place to access at the moment. We know that earlier today, Parliament Road, Harambee Avenue, Taifa Road, and City Hall Way was sealed off by police to allow for ease of movement during the budget reading. This is a tradition, we've seen for a long time, and yet the powers that be have seen it fit to keep it going, even though we know the priority of budget making now is more on Parliament. In fact, it is the final report presented by the Budget Accounts Committee that takes priority in budget, and the CS then now takes it and where there might be some changes, but nevertheless reads the budget highlights and the revenue-raising measures moving forward. But, it seems there's still that focus on the man who carries the briefcase. And this is the second budget that will be read during these pandemic times that we live in. Now, some interesting comments and thoughts coming in from my guests, really about where the state of our economy is at this moment and the concerns they feel about a lack of priority on very crucial areas in what they've seen so far, whether it's in the budget, the BPO, or the some of the documents that have been tabled before Parliament. But I want to hear from you on this one, Caxton.
Yeah.
The accountants that do the thinking for Treasury don't come from Mars or space. They come from institutions like yours. They are members of organizations like yours. Don't they see, don't they hear the same things that you guys are sharing very clearly here this afternoon? Where's the disconnect?
An interesting question, Wahiga, and I would want to give the analogy of lawyers. I happen to be also one. And you will give the same set of circumstances, same set of facts and the law to a lawyer in a case. And between opposing lawyers, you'll come with totally different viewpoints. So the substance doesn't change,
So
it just
if the law is
matters
not
the
clear,
perspective.
then the accounts may also not be very clear.
So what happens, actually, it's interesting because in the world of numbers, things are a lot clearer. Yeah, maybe for lawyers, we keep saying, you don't see black or white, just different shades of gray. And you expect that for numbers, it is what it is. So what happens to that question of what the technocrats at the Treasury look at, I would imagine, because, you know, with being human, we all have biases. Their bias is towards revenue collection. They just want to get as much as they can from this economy, from people's pockets, so that they can fund government programs. Now, when you look at the taxpayer, on the other hand, who we happen to work with most, and we represent such institutions that talk more to what the taxpayer really wants, their perspective is different. And that is why then you will say, we will have a problem with what the technocrats at Treasury will come up with. And that is why they will invite us every time that they have these proposals through these institutions that we do have in this country for oversight as Parliament. They will come with these proposals as they have come with in the bill, and we will make our own submissions. We were before the Parliamentary Committee on Finance and National Planning last week, giving our views about some of these proposals. And it's up now to the parliamentarians to say, look, we have considered this, we have also considered the input from Treasury, and we expect them to be now the natural or the neutral arbiter and do things that really are for the greater good of this country. So they face that dilemma, trilemma, as I said earlier, and to what Rose said earlier, they will have to find out what are these things that we need to prioritize, because we are certainly living beyond our means. We have things that are nice to have. They are not must have, and certainly not at this depressed time. Could we defer them? So we have a very bullish, Treasury. Despite the situation, we are coming here and we are saying, instead of curtailing our spend at this point, because there could be positives about it, but is this the best time? Instead of curtailing the expenditure that we need to incur for this financial year, we go ahead into an expansionary, capital-intensive budget at this crucial time. And not forgetting that they also have to balance between protecting people's livelihoods and lives. So people will ask, is a chicken and egg situation. This government, should they try to just focus on keeping people alive? And you say, you cannot say no to that, Wahiga. You need people alive. But then somebody will tell you, keep me alive and then live on what? So my livelihood is also important. So should we then try to protect livelihoods, then people can take care of their lives? So it's not an easy one. I don't have a straight answer. But you would expect that even in this budget, you are making that delicate balance. If we see that there are some sectors that are really the key drivers, have we found necessary allocations in those sectors? It could be agriculture. Manufacturing, like she said, is great.
Health.
Depends on people, being productive and generating more. Health, again, it's one of the big 4 pillars. So how much have we put, action to the word? We were looking at the budget policy statement that they gave us in February. So there is the statement of intent in terms of the policy statement, and then the actual things that you do through what we see in the finance bill, through the allocations that we see. So there is still that disconnect, and it is really up to Ambassador Uhuru and his technocrats to just keep finding that, because we'll be there to see what we feel will be a better balancing between those two. Okay,
and Michael, before I come to you, I've just seen, that's the picture I was looking for. You can see heads of committees in the National Assembly there, Kanini Kega, Chair of the Budget Appropriations Committee there. That is Amos Kimunya, Majority Leader, chairs of PAC, PIC, amongst others, all waiting to receive the Treasury CS, just preparing themselves for this, even as the Treasury CS's convoy slowly makes its way to Parliament Road, Parliament Building from Treasury. A very short distance for those who have not been there before. but I guess for the cameras, it's being taken at an exaggerated pace to allow those who need to capture the images to do so. Security tight. I mentioned some of the roads that have been sealed off. If you are planning to access the CBD this afternoon, I would warn you to look for alternatives or just go there another day. You might have to deal with some traffic. And remember, this is a budget reading happening with a pandemic and concerns about a fourth wave. So masks are on. Expect to see a lot of sanitizing and so forth, and social distancing within the chambers of Parliament as part of the Ministry of Health COVID-19 protocols, and of course Parliament's own protocols because of the time that we live in at the moment. Michael, let me come to you, and maybe this might be wishful thinking, but is it time for us as a country, and maybe this is something Parliament could take up, to make it mandatory to review previous expenditure in previous budgets? We've already forgotten about our previous budget. Are we asking the important questions? What was allocated? Was it used properly? Was it enough? Because how can we really analyze what a 3.6 trillion budget looks like if we don't really know what a 2.8 to 3 trillion Kenya shillings budget looked like, was used, was it sufficient, was it not sufficient, etc.? Do we need to now start having that conversation?
Certainly, Waiga, that's a conversation that as a country we need to have. But just to remind you that if you look at the Public Finance Management Act, it actually requires that the government balance sheet is issued to show what was spent, what was not spent, what projects are pending, but that nobody talks about. Once the budget is read, people seem to move on. And I think, in my own view, the biggest problem that we have is that there is a very thin line between the executive and the legislature, the Parliament and the Senate, the National Assembly and the Senate. Now, you must put it into perspective that it is the parliamentarians. First, the Public Accounts Committee has the responsibility to review what has happened in the previous year. It is the same National Assembly that makes our budget. And one of the things that has never been discussed before is the conflict of interest between the members of Parliament and the budget that they make. Most of the members of Parliament, it's no doubt that they are partakers in terms of trading with government, taking up tenders in state corporations, in government agencies, in mainstream government. And therefore, even some of the misallocations that we see, the insensitivity in terms of government proposing new taxes during COVID pandemic. And this, as Caxton has said, last Tuesday, I think we met with Caxton, making presentations 1 week to budget to the Committee of Parliament of Planning, which has got the responsibility to hear the public views. Those views have become like window dressing. It's just basically a formality. It is not what was intended in the Constitution 2010 and the PFM Act. So we end up making submissions as a public and on behalf of the public. And you asked the question about what we do as accountants. We do a lot, but the government, both Treasury and Parliament, don't listen because they are one and the same. In essence, there's a conflict of interest in the sense that the parliamentarians, most of them, are partakers in public procurement. Therefore, they will allocate and give money to projects that they are eyeing tenders, or they are hoping that their pending bills will be paid. For as long as this problem persists, the mwananchi is on his own. And
How
that
do we
is the
tackle
biggest
this?
problem I see.
This has been going on for a long time. It's now a habit, if nothing else. And many get into Parliament hoping to enjoy that gravy train as well. How do we handle that?
It's a big problem, and when we don't respect institutions and the law, this is exactly what happens. And I see a lot of blame this week targeted to the presidency, that he has declined to appoint judges and all that. And all the people making these allegations are executing the same mission where they are. So I think it's about the public to be educated about really what to demand of our leaders, whether in the judiciary, whether in the executive, whether in legislature, because this is the problem. The Public Finance Management Act is very clear on the process, for example, of public participation. What ought to happen? How do you publicize the fact that our bill has been tabled in Parliament? We have 7 days ahead of budget to make our submissions, and you make any useful, any use of those submissions. So I do feel that the institutions were very clear. The Constitution 2010 is very clear. The PFM and many other statutes are very clear of what is expected. The PAC reports, when the Auditor General, for example, has finalized their work, I think they are lagging close to 3 years back. So by the time we get the audited financial statements for various state corporations and government ministries and agencies, we'll have forgotten even what that budget was all about. So it's about the government inefficiency and the sort of conspiracy by government against the citizenry. And I think it is time that the public is now educated about what to demand of the leadership they take up. So I do feel that there's a wider problem here because, and not to compare two regimes, but during the Kibaki regime, I looked forward to the budget day. Last 9 years, it has progressively become like high school composition that we wait to listen. And therefore, it has really lost the meaning. It is just something that the public has been taken for granted. And therefore, I do think we have a bigger problem that perhaps is one of the things that when the constitutional review bill ever sees the light of day, whether through a referendum or other means, the citizenry have to really assert themselves in terms of government's accountability in dealing with public resources. I think it is lacking. The institutions that have been put in place are weak, and there's no mechanism to make whether Parliament, the National Assembly, the Executive, the various agencies of government to account for their actions. I do feel we have a bigger problem that requires changes in law.
Let me bring in Hesbon Omolo, who's a council member with ISPAC, to also weigh in on this. And Hesbon, over the last few budget cycles seem to have come with some excess baggage. One is debt that's growing by the day. Secondly is the challenge of stalled projects, and that was mentioned quite a bit by the Budget Accounts Committee, and Appropriations Committee rather. And number 3 is pending bills. And there's a proposal for a special bond to repay those pending bills. Talk to me about that baggage and how it affects the budget-making process and why Kenyans should be concerned about it.
Thank you, Maura. I think the way to look at it, just like I mentioned earlier, we are on autopilot. Now let's imagine what we had in mind some years back. We had the Vision 2030. To date, you can't hear anything about it. If we had focused around it, then every action we take between now towards that period would be aligning us towards where we want to be. Without a vision, it's very difficult to go in the right direction. And that's why we are going wrong. I will give you an interesting statistic. By the time the former president of Kenya took over, we had a public debt of 800 billion. By the time he left, it was 1.8 trillion. So he borrowed $1 trillion in a span of 10 years. Over that period, our ordinary revenue grew by about 600 billion. Very interesting.
Okay.
Now from then...
Pause 1 second.
Yes.
Let me just let our viewers know, in case you cannot see him clearly with the mask on, that's Treasury CS Uhuru Yatani. He's now arrived at Parliament buildings. A journey of 2-3 minutes. It's taken about 10-20 minutes, but of course, you know some of the razzmatazz of the day. So he will then take a few more pictures here, requested by the press, flanked there by Majority Leader Amos Kimunya, Chair of the Budget Appropriations Committee, Kanini Kega, amongst others. That briefcase that when you see it is very symbolic with the budget, even though, as I've been reminding you, under the 2010 Constitution, the Treasury CS really plays a final role in all this. Ideally, Parliament is meant to really be the one that picks the views of Kenyans and sits down and tries to figure out what are the best priorities for ordinary Kenyans. And there's been a big debate over whether Parliament has delegated that role back to the executive. We had quite a fiery discussion in studio here on Tuesday about the same. And my guests here today also are pointing fingers at Parliament and its role in the budget-making process and why parliamentarians really need to step up. So it will be interesting to hear how parliamentarians will respond after that budget has been read, because we know there will be a press conference thereafter. But in a few minutes from now, we expect the Treasury CS and some of these leaders of Parliament to make their way into the chambers, and shortly the formal part of the program will then begin. They will shortly put their masks back on. They had just taken them off because of the protocols. And then we will see them making their way into the chambers of Parliament. Hesbon, apologies for that. Carry on. And you were talking about autopilot. I want to hear more.
Yes. So now, look at it this way. In the last 8 to 9 years, this current government has borrowed close to 7 trillion. And over that period, our ordinary revenue has grown by the same amount it grew over a net borrowing of $1 trillion. Now, the question then that it raises is, have we been borrowing and part of that money going towards funding corruption? Have we been budgeting for graft?
Sorry, just say that again. And I want you to speak, say it in simple language for ordinary Kenyans. We've borrowed over 7 trillion Kenya shillings over the last 9 years.
Yes.
But what the population is generating.
Exactly. My point is, if you borrow money and plow it into an economy,
yes,
the expectation is that that borrowing would eventually translate into more ordinary revenue and, of course, the growth of the GDP. Now, you have a situation where 7 trillion is borrowed, ordinary revenue has grown by about 600 billion. Previously, the same, more or less, revenue growth was achieved by a debt of about $1 trillion. Now, that tells you that we've been budgeting for graft, that is one, or corruption. Then two, the way in which we structure some of the debt. The people who execute these projects probably are foreigners, or the entities that do these projects end up taking the profits out of this country. If you gave a business to me as a resident of this country, any profit I make, I'll probably still plow it back in the country. Now, that's another angle. But the key thing I wanted to mention in terms of what you are raising, as far as the issue of the constant challenge of public debt, the expanding stalled projects, we need to think about...
And pending bills.
And pending bills. We need to change our accounting system. Our government uses IPSAS cash basis accounting, so that by the end of this financial year, those entities that have not spent their money, unless they're parastatals that have what you call the accrual system of accounting, all that money then you can't spend until you have a supplementary budget in the next financial year. Now, it's very easy to lose track, and in the process, some of these pending bills keep piling, and you end up not tracing where we are. Yet we have the Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, which we've operationalized. It's in place. We've consistently moved the target of when all government entities should move to accrual system. And that is what is largely used in the private sector. And nations that have adopted better accounting systems have used it. But imagine in your accounting books, a fixed asset worth so much is just expensed. So in terms of even tracing some of the investments we put in we put our money in, it's very difficult. So it's important that part of the conversation going forward is to enable the Public Sector Accounting Standards Board and the various government departments to migrate to an accrual system. It will be more easy to manage.
Okay. Let me bring in Rose as well, who is the former chair of ISPAC. And Rose, maybe it's a difficult question, but you have a go at it. How do you describe the reign of Treasury CS Uhuru Yatani as compared to his predecessor? Have you seen differences in the priorities? And I'm sure as ISPAC, I'm sure you've closely monitored borrowing, spending, priorities. Any differences that you've seen so far as we watch him make his way into Parliament building between how he's operated vis-a-vis his predecessor, Henry Rotich?
I think he was handed a really difficult, I would say, you know, when you're handed something on a plate and you're supposed to either consume it or deal with it. I think he was... You
can't refuse it.
You can't refuse it, right? You must deal with it. And I think he was handed something that was really, really tough. In addition to that, because already the debt was growing, I know in his first year when he came in, he put a lot of emphasis on trying to pay down the pending bills. And I think there was some level of effort in terms of just even, you know, saying that he was going to deny, you know, releasing cash to various institutions until they actually paid that pending. So he made an effort to do that. He's also dealing with the backdrop of an executive that, you know, is focused on all these big projects. So I'm not sure really what wherewithal he has in terms of being able to tell the president that no, I'm not going to fund the Nairobi Expressway. We know that, yes, it could be a PPP project, but we also know that a significant amount of cash actually went into the leaveways and, you know, paying for the leaveway and all that, the way leaves as they're called, or moving infrastructure to, you know, to allow it to go ahead.
So the moving of infrastructure is on the host company of that PPP?
No, the moving, country. Yes, the moving of infrastructure.
So Kenya bore that cost? Yes,
Kenya bore that cost, while now, of course, I think the organization that was doing the PPP is now doing the actual building. So Kenya still spent quite a significant amount of money. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I know it's a significant amount of money that we spent in terms of the way leaves to get that done. So I think, I don't know how I can put it this way, because he was handed a raw, actually if you say a raw hand or whatever you want to call it, in terms of where he found himself with what he was holding. He attempted to deal with it. And I think he was also pretty honest with us, saying that at some point in time, even going to Parliament and saying that the Treasury is broke and bringing in the IMF. I think for me that was a good move to bring in the IMF, because I think the IMF will be able perhaps to push the government to do certain things that ideally the government would not have been willing to do, including you know, relooking at its debt structure, fiscal consolidation and so forth. So I would not say that I would necessarily blame him in terms of where we are at the moment. This was, as Hesbon has said, this was something that has been growing, because as you continue borrowing, when the chickens come to home to roost, you have to pay, you know, you have to spend an amount of money to repay that debt. And that is where we are, where we're now saying we're going to be spending at least 66% of every single shilling, 66 cents of every single shilling that we raise, we're going to be spending it to repay debt. And that leaves us with 34 cents out of every shilling that we're raising. And that is what we're going to have to use for capital expenditure or even for our recurrent expenditure. So we're in a tough situation.
I think that is clear from what each of you have been saying this afternoon. And of course, let me just keep reminding our guests that we have in studio with us Caxton Kinuthia, Head of Tax, KPMG East Africa. Just speaking a minute ago, so was Rose Mwaura, who's the immediate former chair of ISPAC. We have Hesbon Omolo, who is a council member at ISPAC, and Michael Mburugu, partner, PKF Kenya. A very competent panel helping us understand where we are, why we are here, but also hopefully at the end we'll kind of get a sense of what the way forward would be in the best interests of the country. And Caxton, I want to come to you at this time. Let's talk a little bit about taxes, because Kenyans want to know Finance Bill 2021 and of course some taxes from, I think, Finance Bill 2020 might kick in 1st of July. What can they expect to pinch their pockets? Will there be any relief? And I want to read a saying from Mark Twain, who said the only difference between a taxman and a taxidermist is the taxidermist leaves the skin. I think a taxidermist is the one who finally removes what is inside of an animal, for example, and curates it, so to speak. But a taxman doesn't even leave the skin. So that's the feeling that people have about tax. What's coming up for Kenyans?
Wahiga, thank you. And I didn't know that you're also a lover of quotes. I love them a lot. You know, we quote them because some people are probably wiser than we are, or they have accumulated more experiences. Mark Twain said that, but I prefer the other quote by Austin O'Malley. And this is what he said. In levying of taxes, as in shearing of sheep, it is well to stop when you get to the skin.
Don't go any further than the skin. Are we at the skin?
We are past the skin, if you ask me. And that's really the sentiment, I guess, from most Kenyans, that we are at a point where this government has not just taken, or not be seen to just taken a pint of blood, but they're now taking a pound of flesh as well. So in terms of these measures, and I listened to that question Uhuru Atani was answering when he was asked yesterday about the kind of budget, and he's talking about reliefs. The beauty right now is that there is no longer secret. A day like today, Wahiga, you'll be asking me, speculating, what are the fiscal measures? What are the revenue generating measures? Now it is not a secret. By dint of the Constitution, they were laid before Parliament just before end of April, 60 days to the end of the financial year. So we know all those proposals. And looking at them, there is really no reprieve for a common mwananchi. In fact, all the submissions that we were making last month was just to make it a little easier. And parliamentarians then, okay, the committee members then, just to be fair to them, they would ask us, don't just tell us where to reduce the taxes, but then tell us we need to fund this budget. How do we do it? And what I am saying, and this is a question also, and I promised that my mother, if I get a chance, I will have to say it. She told me, go and tell them not to increase the price of bread. I have heard it is going up. And I said, look, I have already told them. I told the committee members last week that it's a staple food. I don't know how much then you generate in terms of revenue vis-a-vis the cost and difficulty cost the common mwananchi. We tried to do some mathematics, and it was only adding to the coffers about 3 billion. So the thing is, what we would advocate is just a relaxation. We say get more people into the tax net. And there are many ways in which they can do that. And to be fair to people like the KRA, there are things that they are doing well. They are getting people onto the DST tax net. You know, this is the digitalized world. I mean, get as many people so that we can all share this burden. You know, right now it is very skewed against people like me and you who are working in a formal sector. I have a suit and a tie. I've got my pin at the Revenue Authority. They have me in every way. But the people in the informal sector, and they make some good incomes, how do you get them on board? Some of these people are landlords and they have rental income. So we ask ourselves, should we then retain it at 10% and maybe just have 100,000 people paying? Or can we even consider reducing it to 5% and get a million people on board? So they have done well again with this program like the voluntary tax disclosure program. And I think over the last 5-6 months, we have heard that KRA is meeting its month-on-month targets because we are giving Kenyans an opportunity to self-declare and say, look, I want my tax affairs clean. Just incentivize me, give me a waiver, and people are coming. So those kind of programs are going to help. Instead of having this very short-termistic approach where we say, let's target every non-resident, let's come up with a withholding tax of 10%. Yet, on the other hand, we need investors to come in and help us grow this economy together. So some measures are counterproductive. We have said we want to focus on the micro, small, and medium enterprises. Then you go and find that the credit guarantee scheme has actually had a less allocation. So how are these MSMEs who we want to help us to grow the economy going to help us generate? So we look at a short-term way where, because we have a budget, we have to raise 1.8 trillion in this year as our revenue target, then we come up with a raft of measures. I keep praying and hoping at some point we'll get to where countries like the US are, where you do not have revenue targets. All you need to do, just create an enabling environment. Taxes are a matter of course. You let people do their business, you get proper systems for levying of taxes and recording and taking it, then revenues are just a matter of course. You don't have to tell the commissioner of KRA, your target this year is 2 trillion. So he doesn't even know what to do because Treasury is telling him, if you will not perform, if you don't get me 2 trillion, then your work is not even guaranteed or something like that. So let's make the enabling environment better, ease of doing business, and because that is what we are told that generates foreign direct investment. Indeed, Wahiga, they say that anybody that wants to come and invest in this country will not just look to the incentives, the tax holidays, the remissions, the exemptions. No, everybody wants a fair and certain tax regime that there is ease of paying taxes if and when they fall due, that if you ever get into disputes, there is a very clear and certain dispute resolution mechanism. Ours is not so much so because it can be extended indefinitely by the Revenue Authority. Just make the business environment okay. Then taxes will just come as a matter of course. Of course, there is the other bit where you also get the taxes, then also offer the services that those taxes are meant to to offer.
incentivize more people to pay
then
taxes.
people will
It really sounds quite easy, but you know,
Absolutely.
there's something different when reality hits. So there I can see the Speaker of the National Assembly, Justin Muturi. Remember, Parliament has its procedures that it must go through. Remember, the Treasury CS is pretty much a stranger in the House, so there are procedures that have to be followed to allow him to then address the House. And Parliament also might have other matters on the order paper to quickly dispense with before the Treasury CS actually tables that budget. Maybe petitions. We could listen to the Treasury CS for a minute, just get a sense of what's happening right now. The Speaker, and then we carry on with our conversation. Let's just listen in briefly. Okay, we'll go back there as soon as we have something substantial happening. Let me get Michael Mburugu to also weigh in. Michael, let me start with a tweet here. David D tweeted recently, budgets are not money. They're actually plans. Government budgets are usually plans for money that governments don't have to be implemented if and when funds become available. Is that the ideal situation? Why not budget with cash you are sure you have in hand, which is what I'm sure you do in your own home. I'm sure you don't look at your salary, then project ×2, and then you budget with that. How different do governments operate?
Well, theoretically, I do agree with David that budgets are budgets. And that's exactly...
Plans.
They are plans. If you go to the dictionary, it will tell you it's a plan. But no business, no government, no institution will make it without a budget. You always need to look to having a budget. I think the more difficult side of the budget, a budget has two sides. There is the expenditure side and the revenue side, even in your own setup. So, well, in the Kenyan perspective, I think the big problem we have is the expenditure, and I want to explain it this way. You shouldn't budget or over-budget for revenues that you cannot foresee. Equally, you shouldn't budget knowing too well at the start. For example, in this particular year, you have a deficit of close to 1 trillion shillings. So you shouldn't budget that way. And I think our budgeting is not driven by the ability of the economy to support what we budget for, but by the wishes of the people who are in power. Now that takes me back to what Caxton has just talked about. That yes, you can budget for a 3.6 trillion budget, but then you must incentivize the people. And this is two sides of our coin. You don't expect Kenyans or taxpayers to willingly comply with their tax obligations when the money that they give to the government every year is squandered or it is put to the wrong use. And I think that is the biggest problem that we have. Now, we also talked about the failure by government to account for previous budgets. What did you budget? What did you get? How did you spend it? Now, we have a debt ceiling of close to 9 trillion given by the National Assembly, and we are almost busting that. Now, Kenyans must have a conversation. Do we want to continue to budget in an environment where every single year we have a deficit that we must borrow, and those borrowings are not sustainable? So, yes, I do agree that there is need perhaps to look at the bigger scheme of things in terms of budgeting. We must take stock. For example, did we need to budget for SGR all the way to Kedong? Probably to Nairobi, Syokimau, it's functioning. But then lots of billions were put in between Syokimau and Kedong. What would you be going to do with SGR in Kedong for the next 20 years? That's a fact. There's really virtually nothing happening. To break those hills and create the tunnels took a lot of money. It was misappropriated, if I would say so. It was put to the wrong use. And therefore, I agree with David that budgeting is theoretical. But then it can be actualized and made practical by trying as much as possible to achieve results and to prioritize what Kenyans are looking for.
Okay.
Now, if I look at our budget, and I think this is where we went wrong after Kibaki left, the first 5 years is what we need probably to actually investigate. I think the first 5 years of Jubilee government, we went horribly wrong. In the last 4 years, to give it to government, it's not like they have not done anything. We've seen the legacy projects, the big 4 infrastructure, the Nairobi Expressway, for example, We've seen the completion of the SGR, even as much as some of those resources were misplaced. The road network in Kenya today, wherever you go, things seem to be working in the last 4 years. They didn't work in the first 5 years. What went wrong? And it is in the first 5 years, actually, that we took so much of the roads. So I do feel that our budgeting process has been taken over by politicians. And the budgeting process, if you look at the medium-term expenditure framework, which is a 5-year framework for the government to budget within that, as over the last few years, veered off from Vision 2030. And I think that's where we lost the plot. We seem to have deviated from Vision 2030 and the focus that the previous regime created, and went into this, piecemeal kind of touching here, touching there, trying to do this, trying to do that, mainly to appease. So I think really that is where we went wrong, but you cannot do without a budget.
Okay.
You need a budget.
And I'm told we will have to take Parliament live in the next minute or so. So let me give each of my guests just 30 seconds to give a final point. We don't really say expectations anymore. We know those days have changed. But in a nutshell, and Hezbollah, let me start with you on this one. What do you hope to see differently this time round?
I'm not sure, my guy, if we expect to see anything differently. Most of the issues that the CS is going to read about has been shared in the budget policy statement. So nothing much in terms of anything new, but I would hope that going forward, we are able to reduce pressure on the common mwananchi. It's already overburdened. Okay. Therefore, we don't have additional taxes that overburden the common man, especially on essential commodities.
Okay, Rose, how do you respond to that? Anything different that you are hoping for, expecting, or is the train still on the same track that it was on last year?
I'd really want Parliament to take responsibility because every time they're given input from, for example, professional associations, they're not really considering it. I'm thinking in terms of the case of the minimum tax, where we gave them so much input, but they still went ahead. So, so to take responsibility and to look at this is a debt. This is something we'll have to pay over many years. But also, what is the immediate impact on businesses? Money, revenue comes from businesses. What is the impact on the ordinary mwananchi as they have to then fund that budget? So I think that for me is what is going to be really, really important. That and when we say that there's a possibility that the deficit, the debt ceiling might be increased, it's Parliament who has to give that approval. So Parliament really has to take responsibility for all this. One, and make sure that whatever budget is eventually passed, that it is favorable to the ordinary mwananchi, it's favorable to businesses, and can then allow businesses to continue growing and to recover so that they can increase employment and eventually they can, pay more taxes. That is what's going to be very, very critical. And healthcare as well.
Okay,
yes.
And you've raised healthcare quite a bit, and we'll definitely post, sort of the budget reading. I hope each of you will still be able to stay here with me just to analyze if some of your concerns were raised or mentioned during that tabling of the budget. Caxton, briefly tell me this. My prediction is, and because I've heard this before in previous budget readings, that the economy is resilient. But I had guests here previously who said the economy is steps away from a recession, if not a crisis. Where do you place it?
Still bleeding. So I would want to say our economy, before we can talk of recovery, we need to stop the bleeding, stem the tide, and steady the ship. That's what I want the CS to tell us about how they're going to steady the ship before we can talk about recovery. Define for me, so when you say an economy is in recession or an economy is in crisis, what factors then allow for one to properly term an economy as that? And do you have examples of other countries where such economies were labeled as such? To just break it down, where we still have a contracting economy, we have looked at the statistics between Q2 and Q3 of this financial year, and all the statistics that we've received are just showing us that we are not really expanding. So we're not so long as we are not expanding, we are contracting. In the key sectors, agriculture, we have been favored because we have favorable weather so far. and it's the biggest contributor to our GDP, so we have had some cushion there. But the other productive sectors, manufacturing, which is quite key, the healthcare sector, we have our hospitality, our tourism has been a net income earner for top 3 for the longest time. Those things are not doing very well, so we are not at a point where we are saying we are again on takeoff. We just want to contain all our leaks. We have started in some sectors with the tea subsector, for example, we extended to the horticulture, which really helps us in terms of this country. Once all those leaks have been contained, then we can take off again.
Michael, do you have any thoughts on that, defining our economy? Where do you place it and help Kenyans understand? Because over the last couple of days, economists have gone across different media houses describing the economy either as resilient, as in recession, or some have even said we are a financial year or two away from a collapse. Scary words for many, but please help us understand what the meaning is behind some of those phrases.
Right. Speaking to that, I think the first thing is that, as I started by saying, I'm confused because as an economist, as a tax consultant, as an accountant, also a lawyer, I make decisions based on facts. Now, we do not have the economic survey. In fact, what I would expect to see differently before the CS begins his speech is 2 things, either to table the economic survey or to explain why it has not been given to us. As Esbon has just been saying that we are on autopilot, I think I want to add to that we are not just on autopilot, but we are flying an helicopter without night visual instruments in pitch of darkness. And just to speak directly to your question, I think we are headed for a crash. There's no doubt about it. We've seen government now borrowing money and pushing new taxes to correct the taxes and pay. We are paying so much interest in billions of shillings. We have actually a parallel economy running on the people who have lent us money. So if we are paying close to 500 billion in interest every year, that means we have another country we are running out there, not our own country. So ideally, I think it's a matter of time.
How much time? How far are we from this crash that we are now hearing of?
Unless magic happens, I wouldn't give it definitive time, but we are already into 8. Speak to Kenyans who are going to pay 16% more on Brent. They will tell you we are already in 8.
What does a crash look like? Is it a complete default? Yeah. Is that what you then say a country has crashed?
Ideally, I would say so. And it is a matter of time before we can be able to sustain or to be able even to meet our commitments to the people who have given us money. But there's a bigger picture to it. When the population, the citizens, the mwananchi, cannot afford basic meals, everything is so expensive, stress is going to build up. Remember the French Revolution, the Brand Revolution in France. This is exactly what happened. And I think that's the biggest failure. In fact, for me, failure to pay loans that have been handed down to us in a very expensive way is not my worry. My worry is about that ordinary citizen having food on the table, having medicine, getting vaccination at the time of the pandemic. To me, that is the failure. The fact that wananchi cannot access that. We have failed. I don't have to wait until the day Kenya defaults payment of loans to China or IMF or World Bank. To me, we are already in that state. We have failed. The people are going hungry. People are going without medication. People are going, children are going without schools. So this is the failure. So you don't need to look at it from a very bigger picture that we were not able to repay our loans. The fact is that that failure is here with us. It's building the momentum at a very high speed. When you look at how government has failed to prioritize this expenditure, from the health perspective of Kenyans, the welfare of Kenyans, virtually taxing everything in order to be able to repay their loans, those are the nascent days of our government that is actually going for a collapse.
My goodness, okay. These are the accountants speaking, and they are warning us that there could be tough days ahead. Hesbon, let me get from you a picture of the region. Our economy has been dubbed time and time again as the biggest economy in the region. Yeah. Do the numbers still reflect that? Is that the reality, or is it a past perception that we are still holding on to?
I think our economy is still comparatively very strong in this region. Of course, Ethiopia is fast closing in and passing us. Tanzania is closing in. But the wider context of all this is that we have growth in our economy, and that leadership role we have in the region is also masking a very untidy truth that the huge economy we have is largely in the hands of very few people. There's a huge gap between those who hold the real resources in this country and the common man down there. Mm-hmm. A clear example is of the public debt of close to 8 trillion, the interest we pay on it goes largely to the big players. The common man is not part of it, and yet they are the ones paying through the taxes on a regular basis. So my prayer is, as we read the budget today, I want to look at every member of parliament in this country. Every budget, including this one of 3.6 trillion today, you had authorized the CS in February, and therefore you should not complain when the 3.6 trillion budget is read. Ultimately, when in 2 years' time or so, we hit the crash because we've refused to accept the reality. We cannot live on a 3 trillion plus budget without crashing in the near future. We would have done it if our ordinary revenue was growing, but we've not internalized the gap. If we had known why a 7 trillion debt only brings here 600 billion increase in revenue, while somebody else very closely behind us took 1 trillion and gave us close to 600 billion. Let's learn something from there. What was it that Kibaki got right that we've not gotten right? Of course, there may be issues of graft here and there. That is where the fund hits the roof. And if we cannot fix that, we should not go for an expansionary budget, which eventually does not translate in increase in ordinary revenue, which would then sustain the service of the debt that we continue to incur.
Is our budget or our economy expanding because of loans, would you say? Because if ordinary revenue is not growing as it should, what is giving our economy that term expansionary? What is making it grow if the people who make up that economy are not growing themselves? Help me understand in layman's terms.
Of course, in understanding the GDP, there's an aspect of the consumption side of it.
Foreign investment? What is it?
But I want you to look at it this way. We are servicing that debt. Who are we paying this debt to? The public debt, we are paying close to 300 plus billion every year out of the ordinary revenue we get from common mwananchi. This money ends up back into government papers. It doesn't go back to the economy. The ordinary business person there is not able to borrow. In fact, when the banks come for foreclosure, they say, take the keys. We have several properties hanging with auctioneers. They can't even auction them. That is an indication that the economy is in serious problems. The common mwananchi there is not able to afford the basic of stuff. It means that the little they spend when they go buy bread still ends up in national kitty. A majority of it is interest paid to the commercial banks, the insurance companies. Who owns this? They're the big players. So they will continue putting this probably in the brick and mortar. Look at the county governments. The money that gets lost through corruption. The people who work in those counties, they own several concrete jungles in the villages. That money does not plow into the economy. But the common SME player, we have 8.6 billion as a stimulus package. That is where we need to put the money. The manufacturing sector that generates the revenue. These people who have the business acumen, they contribute close to 20% of our taxes. But how much are we giving them back? So those are the issues we need to put our emphasis on so that we can be able to turn around the country. But unfortunately, the leadership we have failed us. Probably the national government CDF fund should have been killed the way the courts decided. It has blinded our legislative role, and therefore our MPs have dropped the ball.
And I want to focus our attention on our MPs. And Rose, I want you to come on this one. MPs this week on different media houses have defended their role in budget making across board. Do they understand their roles? Do you feel so, that they do get what they're supposed to be doing there? Because many say they've dropped the ball.
I'm not sure whether they understand their role. I think it would be hard for me to say whether they do or not. But from when we look at the Constitution and we look at PFM, it's their role to approve, have the appropriations and approve those appropriations. It's their role to set the debt ceiling. So it's really their role to look at what sectors of the economy are very, very important or are critical to the growth of this country, and to make sure that those sectors actually get the right allocation of resources. So they might say that they don't know, that it's not their role, but to be honest, from a very simple reading of the Constitution and PFM, the PFM Act, it's really their responsibility. I have to give you a really good example. When we were looking at the 1% minimum tax that had been proposed, there was a lot of discussions with Parliament, and those discussions actually made it very clear that if you're a thin margin business in this country, let's say, for example, a wholesaler who sells, or a supermarket or a wholesaler who sells cement, you buy that cement at maybe 560 shillings and you sell it at maybe 580 shillings. So
the margins are very
the margins are very thin.
Mm-hmm.
So if you come and say, for every time you sell, and by that time you've not deducted your cost of establishment, your rent, you've not deducted cost of employment. So every single time you sell a bag of cement, you're going to have to pay 1% of that 580 shillings, which is about 6 shillings, to carry as taxes. And we explained all this to them. And yet, if you had looked at, after they went in for debate, if you had looked at the Hansard report in terms of what their comments were, they kept on saying that there are certain companies in this country that have not been paying taxes. And we're saying that is fine, but KRA has all the tools to go after these companies who have not been paying taxes. You cannot penalize the whole economy.
Throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
And that's what I'm saying. I think they really need to, you cannot just take the word that there are companies that are not paying taxes. Yes, we agree there are, but KRA has all the tools. So in that case, I see, and that's what I'm saying, I feel like Parliament has abdicated its role in terms of just relooking at what are those important sectors in the economy. As has been said here clearly, the reason why we're not seeing a growth in the economy, or why it's the Mwananchi, we're saying we have a budget of 3.6 trillion, but Mwananchi is not feeling like this money is getting to their pockets. And the main reason for this is it has been very well articulated. A significant majority of what's driving this growth is really the infrastructure projects. The money for those infrastructure projects does not trickle down to everybody. And the sectors where we could see it trickling down is really agriculture, manufacturing. Those sectors are not necessarily getting the right allocation in terms of the budget to get, and we can even clearly see it from this particular budget. Manufacturing has been allocated 7.5 billion in terms of just being able to expand, to recover from COVID. And yet we know that this is really the biggest employer in the country. When we look at all employment, 70% of employment actually either comes from MSMEs, micro and small and medium enterprises. That's where the employment comes from. Government and perhaps the larger firms don't employ as many people. So these are the smaller companies that we really need to be incentivizing, providing credit. Again, when you come to the issue of providing credit, because government is borrowing so much from the market, I've talked to many CEOs, especially for banks. They tell me that they're better off taking the money they have and going to park them in treasury bills, right? Because why spend so much time and effort going to run after Wanjiko and Atieno and Acheng to give them this money, and yet you have to incur the credit risk, you have to plus cost of running after, going to chase this person, writing, the loan and all that. So we're finding that the MSMEs are starved of credit. So when we look at all those things, and again we hark back to Kibaki's government, what did he do to bring the cost of treasury bills to below 2%? And when he did that, banks were all over the streets, in every single corner, accosting you, saying, Wahiga, do you want to take a loan? Right? And that's how we expanded credit, and that's how businesses grew. So until we have a realization in this country that government does not raise, public expenditure by government does not raise taxes, generate taxes. Taxes are generated by businesses, and therefore for us to generate to increase our tax revenues so that we can be self-sustaining, we must support businesses. We must support agriculture. And the only way we can do that is by making sure we appropriate adequate cash in our budgets, adequate monies in our budgets to be able to support these organizations.
You've raised some interesting points there, Rose, and a lot of you seem to be taking us back to a previous government, and maybe we'll talk a bit about that. But Caxton, let me take you not to a previous government, but to last year. Pandemic hit, a lot happened, the world changed as we know it, but some began to say, could there be a silver lining with this pandemic? For one, it gave African countries or countries in debt an opportunity to renegotiate their debts, suspend some of them for some time. Others felt like countries could now look at their priorities again. How do we get money into people's pockets in the midst of a pandemic as opposed to big infrastructure projects, etc.? Did we handle that moment properly? Could we have done more to help Kenyans survive the tough times that many are still going through right now?
Yeah, to that compound question, Wahiga, I think the simple answer, if I was to say, I don't think we have really taken the silver lining to it. And before I explain that, let me go back to the question you had asked, and I am sure Rose was getting the tough ones about how the CS has performed. And I see, yes, Ambassador Uhuru Yatani came in at a point where things were very tough. Yeah, the economy was already struggling a bit, but then we didn't have the pandemic then. But like we said, he was dealt a cruel hand. Just when he was settling in, the pandemic struck. So my question, and this is what I wanted to say, he had a perfect moment to instill what I would call fiscal discipline. Every time you get into a new role, you have the benefit of saying that you are cleaning the mess of the previous holder. And that was a golden opportunity to do everything right. And he started on a good note where at that point, I remember the discussions, the meetings we had, and I'm sure even Rose had them under the auspices of ISPAC. And Ambassador Uhuru Yatani was, for once, now again accessible, promising us things. We saw some VAT refunds being made to taxpayers. And that honesty, we are broke, was refreshing to hear as well, because we always used to know everything is fine. Then I think where now he lost the moment is not to just take that goodwill where you are a newbie, you are a fresh broom that can sweep better, and institute wide-ranging measures to curb waste, improve efficiencies, reprioritize, because he had the blessings. You're coming into a new docket. Now, more than 1 year into it, it is not easy now to say that it is not him. So when we have this big budget, which we maybe can't fund well, now the buck will stop with him, unfortunately. So I would say, yes, the pandemic really, even for us, we were saying, yeah, we need to look to the silver lining and say, let's help cut waste now. We cannot even afford to spend more. Nobody knows what tomorrow will portend. Nobody knows how this economy will get by. But we all knew it was going south. Yeah, I was looking for some statistics to the comment I made earlier about the contracting economy. And I've realized, yes, the Q1, we contracted by 5.5% compared to a growth expansion.
Which year?
Of this year.
Of this year, okay.
Compared to the same period the other year, where we had expanded by 5%. The good news is the latest quarter, and now we are going with the statistics we are getting from everywhere, because we don't have the economic survey, as Michael said. The contraction is only 1.1%. So it is a good trajectory. So what we would have needed to do, I think, Wahiga, to be now a little more specific, is to look. We have been handed, a golden opportunity. The pandemic here with us. Can we then use it to say, this is the first time we're trying to live within our means? We do not know what tomorrow portends. It happened to those of us who are in private sector. When the situation is very uncertain, you say, look, we are looking 5 years down the line. What do we cut now so that we can survive during this time? Once things are a little certain, then we can accelerate a few programs. I think our government should also have done this. So not just insist, we're in the middle of implementing some great projects. We have a slightly different, circumstance. So we respond. We cannot just remain, we were going east, we will still go east. You can re-strategize, reprioritize, cut back, say defer this to another 2 years. I mean, this country, we say governments are successive, the state is perpetual. It will be here for the long term, so you don't have to finish everything in the next few months. So just spread them out so that not everybody has to suffer, I think the pain of having to achieve too much too soon. We all say, don't bite more than you can chew.
Okay.
And to a great extent, we feel as an economy, we are biting a lot more than we can actually handle.
I want to go back to Michael, and you had quoted something that he said. And Michael, I think you're the one who got us started, taking us back to Kibaki days and talking about how life was a bit easier for businessmen and women. Life was easier for ordinary Kenyans in terms of money in the pocket. But, looking holistically at the times of 2002 to 2013 and 2013 to where we are right now, can you really compare those two regimes with so many other factors that are changing, including the global business environment, etc.? Would you say the Jubilee government has faced the same challenges and had the same opportunities as the Kibaki government? Because I know it's something that has been thrown around quite a bit, but if you take a deep analysis, is it fair to blow for blow, point for point, compare the two governments and what they are going through?
Yeah, Waiga, I think you're right in the sense that there are certain very distinct differences between the Kibaki regime and the Jubilee regime.
First of all, you said you no longer look forward to the budget reading the last 9 years as you did in previous days.
Ideally, it's been academic. Kibaki was a good economist. I think he was leading from the top. In this particular case, I would say the first 5 years of Jubilee, it was randomness. In the last 4 years, I think there has been a lot of input from the top, and that's where we are seeing things working in the last 4 years. But let me put it this way. The one very big difference between the Kibaki regime and the current one is that we have the devolved governments from 2013. That's when they came in place. We cannot lose sight of the fact that it is expensive to finance the county governments. They did not exist during the Kibaki regime. And the question that we also need to ask ourselves, have we created, a very bloated government in terms of creating centers for duplication of efforts, government services, expenditure, and all that? Have we also devolved corruption? That's a big question to ask. So I think there's that very distinct difference between the two regimes. But in arriving at our conclusion that the previous regime did well from an economic perspective, we have taken all that into account and discounted it. There has been opportunities created under the new constitution in terms of, for example, things like the Public Finance Management Act. It was purposefully remained under the new constitution with a view to streamline budgeting, government expenditure, to create accountability, independence of the offices created in the new constitution, the DPP, the Auditor General, they were all strengthened in comparison to the Kibaki regime. So we would have expected to see more efficiency, less blending of public resources. We haven't seen that. So what I can say is this: we are not comparing oranges and apples. We've tried to benchmark and taken into account the differences between the two regimes. Fact of the matter is, the Kibaki regime seemed to be very clear in their mind that they were pursuing Vision 2030 dream. Now, come 9 years ago, the same dream has been pursued, but I think without a clear, clear short-term agenda for the same. For example, if you take the big four, which have dominated the last 4 years, virtually nothing has been achieved. 500,000 housing were expected in the 5 years. I think probably about 1,200, 2,000 have been achieved. It's unlikely to achieve anything. Manufacturing, the second pillar, virtually nothing has happened. That, talk of health, the devolution of the health function to the county government hasn't worked. We have seen a lot of pushback between the county governments, the national governments. Come to food security and all that, we haven't seen deliberate investments in agriculture. We used to hear about the Garana Kuraro project. I don't think it's even a debate anymore, even in this budget. So even within the big four, we haven't seen very clear strategy. Now, one of the few things that I think I want to give it to this government is they have tried to implement the PPP. The Nairobi Expressway is a PPP. You've seen the speed with which it has come up. It's a 30-year span project. I do expect, therefore, the person doing it has ensured there is quality, there is less blending in terms of losing public resources through corruption. I therefore think this really should be our focus. And we are not saying we cannot have a 3.6 trillion. You should actually be talking of 10 trillion budget. But how you finance it, how you raise the resources is what matters. You cannot go borrowing short-term debts to finance 15 to 20-year projects. So I think that's really where we've gone wrong. In terms of seizing the pandemic opportunities, this government had a clear silver lining up there. We didn't see it. Look at it this way, Waiga. With the pandemic and what we saw when the pandemic started, the entire world was relying on China to give us masks and other basic stuff. Now, post-pandemic, I would expect to see our government positioning itself for growth of our manufacturing capabilities so that the rest of the world will be thinking about shifting from over-reliance on China to produce for the world. I haven't seen any stimulus package or any legal framework, whether fiscal or tax, in terms of encouraging investors to come to Kenya and the rest of Africa to put this infrastructure.
I'll have to interrupt you there because I now need to hand over as we listen in to the proceedings there at the National Assembly, where we expect any minute now the Treasury CS Uhuru Attorney will be invited to present, has been invited, will actually take center stage rather. And let's listen in as that happens.